Our talk tonight is on love and sorrow. And so last week we reflected on the passions in general, the emotions. And so tonight we're just going to pick out two of the most important, love and sorrow, and go into them in greater depth. So let's begin with love, which is the most fundamental of all and the most important. Right? And it's the root and motive of every other passion or emotion or affection of the will. Because we can only desire what we already love. We can only hope for what we already love. We can only rejoice in the presence of what we love. And we only hate the contrary of what we love. Right? And we only fear the obstacles to what we love. And we're only angry about the frustration of what we love. Right? So we could go through all the emotions and see how they're all rooted in love. And the Catechism points this out in a beautiful way in number 1765. It says, "The most fundamental passion is love, aroused by the attraction for the good. Love causes a desire for the absent good." Right? So love causes desire, causes the hope of obtaining it, finds completion in the pleasure or joy of the good possessed. The apprehension of evil causes hatred, aversion, and fear, and ends in sadness at some present evil or anger that resists it. No, and that evil will be the opposite of what we love. So all the other affections have their source in this first movement of the human heart towards the good. Love. Only the good can be loved. Now, often we love things that aren't really good. But the reason why we love them is because we think that they're good in some respect. Right? They have the appearance, at least, of good. That deceives us. Right? And so the love is directed to the good, but what we think is good. And so passions are evil if the love that's behind them is evil. Right? And passions are good if the love that's the motive of them is good. So, for example, a hatred will be good if it's motivated by a love for something good. Right? So a hatred, say, of sin is tremendously good. A hatred of error, of falsehood, a hatred of ugliness. Right? Because all of those things are good because they're rooted in love for the good. But if the love that's behind another passion is disordered, well, then that other passion will be disordered. Right? So if I love in an inordinate way, so I'm excessively attached to whatever, money, pleasure, whatever it may be, that disordered love will produce a disordered rejoicing if I get it, a disordered anger if I don't get it, etc. St. Augustine has a beautiful phrase about love, that it's the weight of the soul, as it were, our love. And it takes us in the direction of our love. Okay, so let's look more closely at what love is. And as we know, and Pope Benedict points this out in his encyclical on love. No, Benedict's first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, is a reflection on the nature of love in all its different dimensions. And it ends up with charity, fraternal charity. But it starts out with the philosophical analysis of what is love. Now, so we'll follow Benedict here. And he begins by pointing out that love is a word with so many meanings. Now, and we all know this. And it causes all kinds of confusion in human life because we use the word in different senses, but it's the same word. And so it can lead us into error. Right? We say, and we might think, wouldn't it be better if that weren't so? Wouldn't it be better if there were different words for all the different levels of love? Right? So one word for, I don't know, the love of a sensual love, another word for romantic love, another word for a purely spiritual love, etc. And, well, first of all, that's not the case. We've just got that one word. And secondly, there's a reason for it. And it's actually very, it's important, because love is a ladder. And the very fact that you've got this one word that's used in all these different levels is useful, because it enables us to climb up a ladder to love God. In other words, how do we learn to love God? First, we have to, in the order of human growth, first we learn to love our mother and father. We learn to love our siblings. We learn to love our spouse. And our love of God, in a sense, is mediated by our experience of human love. St. John says this in his letter, that we see our neighbor, and that sensible aspect of human love helps us to climb up to love God. How can we say we love God who we don't see if we don't love our neighbor whom we do see? And that's simply because our human way of knowing is we start with the senses. All of our knowledge has its origin in our sense experience. And so we learn about spiritual love first through love in the family. Okay. So that's why love has all these different levels. So let's look at the different levels. The basic idea of love is attraction to the good and beautiful. It's an attraction. We only love what we think is good and beautiful, or at least potentially good or beautiful. Right? So we can love people who make themselves, in a certain sense, unlovable, but they're always potentially lovable. Right? So nothing is loved that isn't represented as good in some way, as attractive. And so we see that love always presupposes some knowledge of the thing that we love. We have to first know something before we can love it. Right? And that's a fundamental principle. You can't love what you don't know. Right? And that's why when people have religious ignorance, that's not a small tragedy, right? Because you can't love what you don't know. If you don't know who God is, how can you love Him? And this is why faith, we always say faith, hope, and charity. Right? You can't have charity, love for God, if you don't first have faith that tells us who He is, that shows us how lovable He is. Right? And the same thing is true in human affairs. We can't love somebody until we at least know something about them. Right? So love presupposes knowledge. And therefore it's never totally blind. Right? We say that, love is blind. But in reality, love is anything but blind, because it's based on knowledge. And it actually, maybe we'll touch on this later, it can lead us to a much deeper knowledge than anything else. Right? It's only a disordered love that's blind, but not all love. Okay, we saw that there's two fundamental kinds of knowledge that we have. Sense knowledge and intellectual knowledge. Sense knowledge of particular things we know through our senses. Intellectual knowledge of things, universal goods, we know through our intellect. And in the same way, there's two kinds of love. Right? There'll be a love for sensible goods, a kind of sense love, and then there'll be a love for the things we know with our intellect, like truth, goodness, or person. Yeah. And so the most basic, the lowest level of love is sense love. Love of sensible goods. Right? And that's how our first understanding of the word love. And in that sense, love would be a passion. Right? A passion directed to a sensible good. And so we say we love certain kinds of food, or we love wine, or we love beauty, or we love sports, or we love the outdoors, etc. And that kind of love we feel. Right? That's the kind of love that's accompanied by some kind of physical. So that would be the, infatuation. A person falls in love in that sense. Based on the sensible appearance of another person, more than their personhood. Right? That would be sense love. And it's not a bad thing. It leads us into higher things. But it's a passion. And so in that sense of the word love, we use it synonymously with, say, like. I like chocolate cake. I love chocolate cake. That's on the sense of. Let's go to the higher kind of love. Love in the will. And so love in the will presupposes that we know something with our intellect as good. Right? And so love in the will goes beyond our senses. So if the intellect understands something to be good, like justice, then love is aroused in our will for that. And then that's the sense that we love God, that we love truth, that we love our country, for example, that we love virtue, or that we love another person as a person. Right? Now, when we love another person, the two kinds of love can be mixed, because at first we can be attracted by their sensible appearance. And in romantic love, obviously that plays a big part at first. Right? But love in the will has to be the principal thing, because that's the principal thing in the person. Right? The principal thing in the person that we're loving isn't their sensible appearance, but is their personhood, which the senses can't grasp. And therefore, but the intellect can. And so the will is loving something higher in the person than our passion. And so a love that's purely directed to the sensible aspect won't last, for obvious reasons, because the sensible beauty won't last either in the person that we love. Right? And what's highest in the person is interior. Karol Wojtyła has a beautiful reflections on this in all kinds of different places, but in particular in his book Love and Responsibility. So he's speaking here about the growth of love. And so he says, we should remember that a human being is a person. A being whose nature is determined by his or her inwardness, not by our exteriority. It is therefore necessary to discover and be attracted by the inner as well as by the outer beauty, and indeed more attracted by the former than the latter. And this has very special importance to the love of man and woman, in other words, romantic love, which is, or at any rate ought to be, love between persons. The attraction on which this love is based must originate not just in a reaction to visible and physical beauty, but also in a full and deep appreciation of the beauty of the person. Now, if that's true of love of our neighbor, right? How much more true it is of love of God, whom we don't see. Right? And so, the love by which we love God is obviously love in the will, and not love as a passion. And therefore, it's not a sign that we love God more if we feel, the kind of feeling that we feel in sensible love, right? Because this is a higher thing. Right? And that's very important in the life of prayer. Right? Sometimes we think that if we don't feel the sensible consolation, we're not loving God as much as we would if we felt that. And in reality, it doesn't have anything to do with it, because that's the kind of thing that's associated with sensible love. Okay. All right, let's make another so we made our first distinction: sensible love and love in the will. Let's now make another division, which is a little more difficult. The basic idea of love is to will the good for someone. I think we could all agree with that. That to love is to will good for the person that we love. And you can see that willing good for someone, there are two components. Willing good, in other words, an attraction to a good, and then that willing that good for someone. In other words, there's a personal dimension for someone, and there's an object dimension, willing some good. And in English, we don't have two good words for this. But in Greek, there are two words that express those two kinds of love: eros and agape or agape. Eros would be we could say love of desire, desiring a good. And agape, we could, in English, love of benevolence, is willing that good for a person. Right? So, love of desire to a good, and love of benevolence to a person, for whom we will the good. Right? So, for example, I love my mother, and I want her to be happy. And so even there are the two aspects. I want happiness for her. And so there's a kind of love of desire for, say, some good. Or it could be, as a parent, you want good for your children. You want them to have a nice house. And so there's a love of desire for the house, but there's a love of benevolence for the person, say your child, for whom you want that. And if we look at at every love, we'll always find those two dimensions. Not because to love is precisely to will the good for someone, and the someone might be me. Right? So a person loves, an alcoholic loves wine for me. But I can just as well love the good for another. But in either case, there are those two aspects: a good willed and a person for whom it's willed, myself or someone else. Right? So St. Thomas Aquinas, when he analyzes love, he divides it like this: love of desire, he calls it love of concupiscence. It's the same thing. We could call it also need love, right? Because it's a love for some object that satisfies some need love. Or we could call it eros, with the Greek term. And eros doesn't just mean erotic. Eros is precisely that movement to the good. So, for example, Plato, when he speaks of eros, he speaks of it with regard to the truth, right? That desire for this tremendous good, truth, or beauty, or goodness, or God. Right? And so, eros for God is a very good thing. And that's a love of desire for God, who is the good, the beautiful. And that, in Christian terminology, we call it hope. Right? Hope is that love for God as our good. Okay? So the name, love of concupiscence, might lead us astray. It might make us think it's something bad, or something negative, or eros likewise. But it's actually good or bad depending on what we love. Right? Whether it's something good for us or something bad for us. Right? If we love with love of desire something good for us, then that love is very good. Right? And the more we have of it, the better. Right? The more we have an eros for God, the better. Right? The more we have a love of desire for say, truth, or for holiness, or for charity, right? The better. And which of these is primary? Which, in a sense, we might say, the thing that comes first is need love, right? That comes first in human life. The baby will first have need love, right? He'll love his mother for her care for him, right? So that'll be, in the order of generation, chronologically, love, eros, in that sense of need love, love of desire, will be the first. So the baby loves the mother because she's good for him. And then only later he comes to love her for herself and will the good for her sake. And so we see that love of desire leads us to love of benevolence. Right? So the baby first loves his mother because she's good for him, and then he loves her for herself. So in the order of generation, love of desire is first. But in the order, we could say in the metaphysical order, it's the other way around. That love of benevolence, love for a person, has the primacy. Because that's the reason why we have need love. But we love goods precisely so as to will those goods for a person. So you can see that that's the reason for being of need love. I confused you with that. We love objects for whose sake, ultimately? For the sake of persons. Right? And so the love for persons, love of benevolence, in that sense, has the primacy because it's that for the sake of which we love objects. So if in our life we're focusing just on objects, obviously that would be immature in the sense of that need love is to lead us to love of benevolence. Right, so we can say that need love is directed to objects, love of benevolence to persons. And love of friendship, so how would love of friendship be different from, say, love of benevolence? So love of friendship is a special kind of love of benevolence. Love of benevolence is directed to a person, right, willing the good for a person. Love of friendship is when that love of benevolence is mutual. Right? So you've got friendship when there's a mutual willing the good for each other. Right? So in every friendship, there'll be a mutual willing the good. In other words, a mutual love of benevolence for one another. And love of friendship requires a sharing of life. You know, that there's a certain sharing of life and a mutual willing the good. In that love of benevolence, you're willing the good for another. The highest form of willing the good for another is giving oneself for the other. So the highest form of love of benevolence, we could say agape, is self-gift. Willing for the other, for our beloved, the good of our own selves. Right? In other words, giving ourselves to that other. And so love of benevolence we could call oblative love, in the sense of a self-giving love. Right? And so in marriage, which on the natural order is the highest form of friendship, right? St. Thomas calls marriage maximum friendship. It's a beautiful definition. So in marriage, there's a mutual love of benevolence in which the two are giving each other their selves. Right? So there's a mutual self-donation that has to be total for it to be maximum friendship. Right? And that's what sets marriage aside from every other form of friendship. The other forms of friendship aren't a total self-donation, only marriages. And that's why it's the best image of the love for God. Right? And so love for God is, in Revelation, is always described in terms of the analogy of marriage. Right? That God enters into a marriage with Israel out of his love for her. Right? But it has to be mutual. He takes the initiative, but of course Israel has to love him back with that same total self-gift. And the same is true in the church. And the church, by her very nature, is bride. Okay, so let's look at the interaction between them. Right, so I think we've already discussed this. So I'm going to. Benedict speaks of the interaction between eros and agape in his encyclical, and he says, the two aspects, eros and agape, find a proper unity in the one reality of love. Right? So the more they're unified, the more the true nature of love is realized. Right? We're never going to have a pure, love of benevolence, a pure agape that doesn't have any need love, because we're needy. Right? That would be ridiculous for a needy being to not have need love. So we're always going to have it. But our goal is to have the two aspects of love most perfectly united. Even if at first, eros is at first mainly covetous, in other words, mainly needy, he says, for example, in romantic love, a fascination for the great promise of happiness. Right? That promise of finding happiness, say, with another person for life. That would be eros. No, that would be the sense of love of desire. But the more one grows near to the other, right, the more it becomes less and less concerned with oneself, and increasingly seeks the happiness of the other. Right? That's the genesis of, we could say, agape. Wants to be there for the other, wants to bestow itself on the other. And so the element of agape enters into this love. Otherwise, eros would end up impoverished. In other words, if a love, yes, maybe our loves start as eros, but if they end up just as eros, then they're impoverished and they'll die. But we can't live by oblative love alone, right? Precisely because we're needy. We can't always give, but we also have to receive. Right? And so everyone who wishes to give love must also receive love as a gift. And in some sense, that's a very beautiful gift to the other, is precisely receiving the other's love. Right? And if that's true in a say, romantic relationship or a spousal relationship, it's more true of God. Right? One of the most beautiful ways that we express our love for Him is precisely by being open to receive His love for us. And so the two kinds of love form, we could say, a vital circle. There's a vicious circle, but there are also vital circles. And so here, eros and agape, they form one of those vital circles, where eros leads to agape, and but not in such a way that we lose eros. Each one perfects the other is the idea. Okay, we said the highest form of love is gift of self. And this is one of the things that John Paul II has spoken of again and again. It's one of the central aspects of his whole teaching, his whole magisterium. And we see this above all in the Paschal mystery. Right? Christ shows us the true nature of love as precisely total gift of self for the beloved, which is us. Right? So being a victim of love to God the Father and to every human being. But everyone is impelled to that same self-donation simply by having human nature. And so if a person doesn't realize that kind of love in their life will seem empty to them, and it will be so. Right? And that's because by being a spiritual creature, we have self-dominion, self-possession. Because we have self-possession, we can give ourselves to another. A being that's not free can't give themselves freely because they don't own themselves to give themselves. Right? And so that's why ultimately an animal can't, they have affection, but they can't truly give themselves freely to another, although it might seem that they are. But that's proper to a spiritual being, that we can, because we have self-possession, we can give ourselves as a gift. And we're capable of doing so to our neighbor and to God. And if we don't do so, our nature will be unfulfilled, because that's what our intellect and will are ultimately for. John Paul II has expressed this in his first encyclical, one of my favorite texts. He says, "Man cannot live without love. He remains a being that is incomprehensible to himself. His life is senseless if love is not revealed to him, if he doesn't encounter love, if he doesn't experience it and make it his own, if he doesn't participate intimately in it." And this is why Christ the Redeemer fully reveals man to himself. And that's a phrase from Gaudium et Spes 22 that John Paul II quoted, 1,000 times. That Christ reveals man to himself. And he does so, above all, in this oblative love, self-giving love, to the end. And so John Paul II speaks of that as the human dimension of the mystery of redemption. In other words, revealing how we achieve fulfillment. Right? In this case, supernatural fulfillment, because it's supernatural love. And John Paul II is inspired by Gaudium et Spes 24, and the other text that he cited 1,000 times. A very beautiful text, which says, "The Lord Jesus, when he prayed to the Father, that all may be one as we are one, he opened up vistas closed to human reason, because he implied a certain likeness between the union of the divine persons and the unity of God's sons." In other words, when Jesus prays that they, meaning us, the church, that we in the church may be one, as we are one, that's the Son and the Father are one, he's saying that the union in the Trinity is the model for the union of love in the church. And that reveals to us that man, the only creature on earth that God wills for himself, can't fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. Right? Because human life is based on the model, the exemplar of the Blessed Trinity. And even in the Trinitarian life, the life of the three divine persons, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, culminates in the Son is generated as the Logos, the Word of the Father. Through God's knowing himself, the Son is generated as the perfect Word that says everything that the Father is. But the Spirit is breathed forth as the fruit of love, the mutual love between the Father and the Son. So we can say that the Holy Spirit in the divine life is the divine self-gift. The Spirit proceeds as the fruit of love, the mutual love of Father and Son. And so the divine life culminates in love. And love which is a total self-gift. In other words, the self-gift of the Father and the Son is so perfect that it creates a person who is God. In other words, the self-gift of Father and Son is a self-gift so perfect that it's God, the Holy Spirit. And that shows us that we too are called to that as the culmination of our own life, to make ourselves a gift. And that's why it ends, the human being can't fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. And then in the Incarnation, Christ shows that in the Paschal mystery, in dying for us. Right? So our very nature impels us to that. So by being a rational creature, we're capable of giving ourselves, and thus we're not simply a rational animal, we're a social animal, and thus we're called to communion by our nature. Right? And that's why when we find ourselves in solitude, it causes a profound misery. Okay, so let's just summarize what we've said. We saw that there were two levels of love: sensible love and love in the will. And love in the will has these two aspects: love for a good, and which we could say love of desire, or need love, and willing that good for a person, love of benevolence. If that love of benevolence is mutual, then we get love of friendship. And maximum love of friendship will involve giving ourselves. And that maximum love of friendship is realized on two levels. Marriage, a maximum gift, so that it's a total self-gift to another person, and because it's total, it can't be taken back. And that's why marriage by its nature is indissoluble. We'll talk more about that in another talk. And then it's realized in a higher way in that mutual total self-gift to God, of which marriage is the natural image or likeness. So love is the motor of our whole spiritual life. And as we said at the beginning, according to whether our love is good, so our whole lives will be good, because love is the motor of everything that we do. And that's why St. Augustine, when he's reflecting on the whole of human history in his book, The City of God, he's reflecting on human history and how, and ultimately, human history will end up after the judgment in two camps, right? Heaven and hell. But already in human history, we can see those same two camps, although we can't distinguish, only God can. But every person in reality is either in the city of God or in the city of Satan, based on our love. And so St. Augustine has this great line. He says, these two cities, we could say two civilizations, two ways of living life, are created by two kinds of love. And ultimately by two persons to whom we direct our love, God or ourselves. In other words, everyone, every human being that gets the age of reason, in reality, is ultimately loving everything for the sake of a person, and that person will be ultimately either God or it'll be myself. And that's the basis on which we will be judged. Right? That's why it is that God can separate humanity into two camps. Because every human being who gets the age of reason will, in fact, as St. Augustine says here, either ultimately be loving God above all things to the point of contempt of self, no, if necessary, the martyrs, but all of us, or will be loving themselves to the point of contempt for God. And how is that realized? By being willing to break a commandment in serious matter. In other words, mortal sin. Mortal sin shows me who I'm loving. Right? That I'm loving myself even to the point of contempt for God. And so if you go through, in the City of God, St. Augustine goes through the whole biblical history and sees those two cities, the City of God and the City of Man, right from the beginning. And the easiest, well, obviously in Eden, they start out in the City of God, but they both end up in this City of Man through their sin. And then their two sons, Cain and Abel, right? The City of Man and the City of God. And then you go through all of human history and you see biblical salvation history and all of human history, and we see those same two cities based on two loves. Okay, let's look now at sorrow. So let's try and do the same thing. Sorrow, just like love, has many different dimensions and levels. And so the first division of sorrow would be exterior pain and interior pain. And so exterior pain will be the purely sensible, and interior, still a passion, but not merely physical, right? But rather interior or moral. So exterior pain comes above all from our sense of touch, but all the senses it could be. And moral suffering, and that's common to the animals, right? That's precisely what the animals suffer. Moral suffering is what's proper to man alone. So only man can have a sorrow at receiving injustice, because he understands justice, and he can experience the lack of it, whereas the animal can't. And those two kinds of suffering, exterior and interior, reflect the two dimensions of man, body and soul. And so in human life, we find both, and we find them often intimately intertwined. But if we had to pick which one is more intense, which suffering is greater suffering, which would it be? The moral suffering. Right. The interior suffering can be much more intense than physical suffering. And even if that physical suffering is extreme. And we can see this from the fact that we can choose physical suffering precisely so as not to have moral suffering. Right? Parents would rather physically suffer than have their children do evil things. Or we'd rather physically suffer than have another suffer, and thus feel the moral suffering of that extreme compassion. And we see it even in the Passion of Christ. Obviously, his physical suffering was inconceivable to us. But what was greater, his physical suffering or his moral suffering? Right? His moral suffering is what led him to sweat blood in Gethsemane. Right? And that was clearly immensely greater than his physical suffering. And John Paul II has a great apostolic letter on suffering. That's what we're going to follow here. It's a stupendous document, and it's very it's a good thing to reflect on, I think, in Lent, and especially when faced with the problem of suffering in ourselves and others. It's called Salvifici Doloris, of the saving power of pain. So, in other words, the salvific nature of pain, of sorrow. So he writes, suffering is something wider than sickness, more complex, more deeply rooted in humanity. And so he speaks first of this distinction between physical and moral suffering, based on the distinction of man between body and soul. So moral suffering is pain of the soul, pain of a spiritual nature. And there are so many forms of it, right? It's vast, no less in number than the forms of physical pain, and I would say much greater. And if simply reading salvation history, reading the history of Israel, we find all the dimensions of suffering. So, for example, the death simply, right? The first suffering brought in by Adam and Eve. The death of one's own children, the death of the firstborn, the lack of offspring, exile from one's homeland, persecution, hostility, mockery, scorn, loneliness, abandonment, betrayal, etc. The sacred history shows us all of those forms of moral history, of moral sorrow. And when the two are coupled together, then suffering becomes maximum. Right? If somebody at one and the same time has physical suffering and then moral suffering, and there are different dimensions of moral suffering. So, for example, there's the moral suffering of compassion, of betrayal, of abandonment, etc., etc. Christ in his passion, if we analyze it, will see that he willed to experience every kind of suffering all at the same time, and all in the maximum degree that is conceivable. So that all of them working together would be what he could offer for our salvation. Okay. St. Thomas, when he looks at sorrow, he divides sorrow into different types or kinds. So let's look at that. So St. Thomas sees 5 kinds. Perhaps one could also classify it differently. But in any case, he sees 5 fundamental kinds. Contrition, sorrow over one's own sin, which would be the highest sorrow. Pity, sorrow over one's neighbor's misfortune. Envy, sorrow over one's neighbor's good. And that's always disordered, right? Because our neighbor's good is not a proper cause for sorrow, but for rejoicing. Anxiety, a sorrow over impending evils. And depression. And of those, depression is, in some sense, the gravest, in the sense that it immobilizes the soul. It causes a spiritual torpor in which action becomes almost impossible. Right? It leads to the loss of appetite and desire, paralyzing the appetitive faculty. That's why depression is such a grave thing in human life, because it's paralyzing, as it were, the motor, which was love, that leads us to activity. And that depression can have different species also, different kinds. And the gravest is when it affects the religious sphere. In other words, a depression that would involve a complete repugnance for all the things of God. And the fathers of the church speak about that in the spiritual life as the gravest malady in monasteries. Right? So it can happen also in religious life, that a person, having already given themselves to God, can experience a certain repugnance for the things of God. And the spiritual writers call it, in Greek it would be asadia. It could be translated lukewarmness, but for the things of God. Now, in today's world, increasingly secularized, precisely that kind of depression seems to be spreading more and more. Right? The more atheism spreads in a society, the more that spiritual depression of having an emptiness. In other words, not knowing why one should get up in the morning, right? Not knowing the meaning of one's life, or how what would be the purpose of my doing anything. And in a certain, obviously that's always part of, in every society there'll be some, depression can have physical causes, there'll always be some forms of depression. But it seems that in our society, that kind of depression has vastly increased, as a natural result of a situation that never really existed in the way that it does today in our society, the spread of mass atheism or agnosticism.
Are you separating that from the manic depression that's treated by lithium?
Right.
So that's an organic as opposed to the depression you're talking about.
Right. In other words, these emotions are... great question. Let me see if I can... The passions are at the intersection. Right? We said that all of human life is marked by this intersection of the spiritual and the physical. Our emotions, in a unique way, show that intersection. Right? Because they're bodily, and yet they're not unaffected by what happens in our minds, because they're triggered by our imaginations, by how we look at things. And so disordered emotions can have two causes, from above or from below. right? From the body or from the spirit. And any particular case, say, of depression can either be predominantly caused by the physical or by the spiritual, or by both put together. Right? And so it's very important to know which is the principal cause, so as where to put the principal diagnosis. And so here I'm just going to focus more on the spiritual cause, not to say that there can't be, and isn't very frequently, a physical cause. And that will be something that will be always with us, right? You'll find that in every society, there are people who have, because of our bodily constitution, conditions like manic depression, schizophrenia, etc., that aren't caused by spiritual causes, but by physical ones. Even though a particular trauma may set it off, the physical cause was there from before, from the start. But anyway, let's look here at the spiritual aspect. Karol Wojtyła, before he became Pope, there's a beautiful little book of spiritual exercises. He preached, I think it was in 1962, to college students. It's called The Way to Christ, Spiritual Exercises. And in one of these talks, he wrote, "People today often talk, especially in psychology, about the dangers of frustration, the loss of a sense of value, unsatisfied or unfulfilled need or desire, that can shatter the personality. This danger of frustration is always present where there's no system of reference to higher values." Right? If a person doesn't have above all, atheism. It must be recognized that in the present age, this danger hangs over each person because of the lack of a higher system of values to which to refer one's hopes and one's mind, one's will and heart. This danger sometimes pushes us to great lengths, and even so far as violence, crime, and certain other antisocial behavior. Now that's something that Viktor Frankl had worked out in those same years and a little bit earlier. Viktor Frankl was a psychologist from Austria, very great and noble man. He studied with Freud first. Now Freud put the root of psychosis in what he calls the libido. In other words, in what's lowest in man, in the lowest aspect of passion, which for Freud was always sexual. In other words, Freud thought all mental illness was a result of repression of the sexual urge, which he calls the libido. And Viktor Frankl came to see that it was so often just the opposite, that the cause of mental problems was very frequently from above, not from below. In other words, but from the lack of what ought to be above. In other words, from the lack of a sense of meaning that gives direction to our life. Right? When a person doesn't have any direction, they don't know why they're getting up in the morning, it's very easy to fall into an existential crisis. And so Viktor Frankl, he formed a new way of therapy, which he calls logotherapy. Logo from the logos, meaning the idea, as opposed to, libido therapy of psychoanalysis. And this theory he worked out in the 30s, but it was confirmed when he went to Auschwitz. He was Jewish, Viktor Frankl. When he was taken to a concentration camp. And when he got there, they confiscated his book that he had written on logotherapy. And so he had a reason to live to rewrite that book, because he thought he had a mission in life to pass this on to humanity, among other things, obviously also for his family. But in any case, he had a reason to get up in the morning in the camp. And what he noticed was that the inmates that didn't have a reason to survive, in other words, didn't have a meaning that would motivate their fighting, they would die in the camp, and rapidly. He said you could see all the telltale signs. They'd instead of trading in cigarette butts for, a piece of bread, they'd smoke them. They wouldn't get up, even though that meant they'd get beaten. They'd give up. And so he saw this as a kind of symptom of something much broader, that when we don't have a sense of the meaning in life, that causes a particular form of sorrow, which is precisely depression. Depression from above. And so he says this: every age has its own collective neurosis, and every age needs its own psychotherapy to cope with it. The existential vacuum, which is the mass neurosis of the present time, can be described as a private and personal form of nihilism. Nihilism comes from the Latin word nothing. So nihilism would mean nothingism. And the idea of nothingism is that there's no meaning in life. And what's incredible is this is something that many intellectuals in our universities teach as the highest truth. But in reality, it totally would destroy your life if you were to buy into it. And especially if society were to buy into it, it would destroy a society. And so he sees that as the mass neurosis of our time, existential vacuum. And he sees other things like, say, the drug scene as one aspect, one manifestation of it. Addictions, depression, aggression, addictive compulsive behaviors, etc. So he sees so many of those behaviors as coming out of an existential vacuum. And that existential vacuum is not unrelated to the spread of atheism in our society. Right? That's why a society that thinks that it doesn't matter from the point of view of, the common good, whether there's religion or no religion, whether there's faith or no faith in a society, that's blind. Right? That would be blind to the effects of atheism in a society. So he has these statistics, Franco, connecting, say, alcoholics with 90% who suffer from an abysmal feeling of meaninglessness. Again, it's not to say that in every case, because there are also physical aspects that make one person more prone than another. But both causes are at work. Cardinal Ratzinger, before he became Pope, made some similar observations. He says, the great collective pathologies that we have today rest on the fact that there's some deficit in man's life. He perceives a lack of meaning. In this sense, we ought to have the courage to rise up against what is regarded as normal for a person at the end of the 20th century. In other words, normal to have a meaningless life and to rediscover faith. The most extreme form of this existential vacuum, I think, is analyzed by one of the most famous atheists of the 20th century, Jean-Paul Sartre, an existentialist philosopher, French, who took atheism as his first principle. His goal in philosophy was to make a picture of what the world would look like, what the world, because what he thinks is, what the world is, based on the first principle that God doesn't exist. Now, he doesn't prove that God doesn't exist, because you can't prove that God doesn't exist, because he does exist. But Sartre didn't try to prove that. He simply took it as an axiom, as a principle, because if God exists, then I'm not God. If God exists, then I don't have absolute freedom. Therefore, God does not exist. What does the world look like? And the world looks like a place in which there's no meaning. And so Sartre has, one of his books is called Nausea. And this notion of nausea is actually a central concept in his whole system. Nausea is what the wise person comes to feel habitually. It's like if you're seasickness, precisely because there's no solid ground, in a boat in the high waves, you feel seasick because there's no foundation. If God doesn't exist, there's no moral foundation. Right? Because if there is no God, Dostoevsky said this most profoundly, if there is no God, then everything is permitted. Because who's there not to permit it? Now, a lot of people are incoherent with this. No, there are many, many atheists who want to defend moral values, and that's good, and we want to encourage them, not discourage them. But nevertheless, it's incoherent. Because what are those moral values based on? My sentiments? That's not enough to base a moral conviction on. And so ultimately, Sartre is much more coherent. He recognizes, since God doesn't exist, he thinks, there are no values written into the universe. And therefore, each one has to write the values into the universe for himself. But you have no basis for writing them into the universe. And so therefore, you're writing them in without any basis, and that causes nausea and total anxiety. And therefore, the wisest person is the one who feels nauseous all the time. Existentially. Sure. Now, he doesn't do that. But good thing. Thanks be to God. But, see, it's very good that people are incoherent with bad principles. But anyway, we can draw a lesson from it. Right? That's where it goes. That's where this thing leads. Now, so for Sartre, the world is absurd. That's kind of the centerpiece of his existentialism. The world is absurd. Now, normally when you do an argument, and how do you show somebody's wrong? You say, that's absurd. Right? That's the very sign of an error. And so if he's coming out with a philosophy in which the whole world is absurd, what's the absurd thing? His philosophy. Right? That's the very, and I don't mean that as a kind of cheap shot, but very seriously. Right? That's the sign that his philosophy is about as false as you can get. Because it's about as absurd as you can get, and he recognizes it. But in any case, that nausea that he describes is something that we see out there. It's precisely that existential vacuum that Viktor Frankl is talking about, that Karol Wojtyła was mentioning, that Pope Benedict, etc. And that all of us see. All right, remedies for sorrow. St. Thomas has a little treatise on sorrow in the Summa of Theology. And we tend to think of St. Thomas as being very abstract and abstruse and metaphysical. But here in this treatise on sorrow, he talks about remedies that are very practical. And so he asks, for example, I didn't give it to you here, I don't think, but hot baths, is that a remedy for sorrow? And so he says, yes. And so, but more seriously, tears are a remedy for sorrow. In other words, it helps us to bear sorrow, to externalize it. And that's a remedy, that's a solace. There's a beautiful passage in St. Augustine's Confessions where he speaks about his mother, St. Monica's death. And so he knew that she died as a saint. And so in theory, he doesn't want to sorrow over her because he knows that she's in a good state. And so he tries to hold back the tears. And when he succeeds for a few hours. And then he says the floodgates opened and he just cried. And that was a tremendous consolation. Right? And that's true in general, because simply we're letting out what was too much interior. And then a second remedy for sorrow is sympathy of friends. Right? And for two reasons. First, because that sympathy of our friends enables, as it were, our friend to bear a part of our sorrow. So what's borne by two is lighter. Right? And this is so true. We see in our own experience. It's like you've got a heavy load. If two people carry it, it's so much lighter. And then the second reason is because the sympathy of friends shows us it's an expression of their love for us, which obviously offsets the sorrow by providing a reason for joy. Now, if that's true, that the sympathy of friends helps, how much more the sympathy of God? And thus prayer is the best remedy for sorrow. And St. Thomas expresses in a way typical of St. Thomas, the greatest of, he says, a remedy for sorrow involves allowing one a certain pleasure to offset the sorrow. Well, the greatest of all pleasures is contemplation of the truth, contemplation of God. And so, to a certain extent, one forgets one's sorrows if one goes out of oneself in contemplating, say, the mysteries of our faith. Of course, it's hard to do so, but above all, bringing them to the Lord, right? Precisely bringing our struggles to God in prayer. But the greatest remedy for sorrow is recognizing the meaning of that sorrow. And that would be recognizing the redemptive value of suffering. Right? And this is where the Passion of Christ is we could say, the gospel of suffering. Right? That's a phrase of John Paul II. He uses that in this text, Salvifici Doloris, over and over again. That the Paschal mystery it's the ultimate revelation of God and of human life. And therefore, it's the ultimate revelation about one of the greatest problems of human life, the problem of suffering, the meaning of suffering. And so the Passion shows us that suffering is precisely the means for the manifestation of love. Right? That suffering was the means by which Christ redeemed the world. Not the suffering alone, but the love that motivates the suffering. The love and the suffering together. And therefore, every human suffering has been given by Christ's suffering an ability to share in that redemptive value of the Passion of Christ. And therefore, no human suffering, no matter how interior or hidden or whatever, great or small, is incapable of sharing in the redemptive value of the Passion of Christ. And therefore, every suffering, if carried in love as Christ carried his, is in fact the greatest thing that we can do for the church, for those that we love, for society. And so John Paul II has a great section on this in his Salvifici Doloris. He writes, suffering cannot be transformed and changed by a grace from outside, but only from within. Right? In other words, coming to see the meaning of that suffering. Right? And that's why the existential vacuum is so painful, because it's suffering without any meaning. And that's why the redemptive value of suffering is so important, right, for our lives and for society. Society is losing it. And precisely when everyone always encounters suffering, right? You look into human life and you find a suffering that you had no idea of. Right? And God supplies this for a reason, right? He supplies it precisely because it's ultimately the means by which we learn to love and the means by which we can offer something as the most profound gift of self. In other words, a gift of self is meaningful when it costs me something to give. Right? It's easy to say, I love you, but it's the proof of it is the ability to offer suffering for the sake of the beloved. Right? And that's why suffering can have such a profound redemptive power, because it's, we could say, the proof of love. And so Christ in his Passion, he offers an answer to the problem of suffering that isn't merely, a philosophical answer. It's not as if in philosophy we solve the problem of suffering on the blackboard. No, he solves it by giving meaning to suffering, which is the greatest meaning that it could have, the meaning of charity, the meaning of love. Right? So it's more than an abstract answer. It's a call. It's a vocation, right? These are John Paul II's words. It's a vocation that everyone encounters, because all of us are going to experience it. Christ doesn't explain in the abstract the reasons for suffering, but he says, follow me. Right? Take up your cross and follow me. Come, take part through your suffering in this work of saving the world. Right? That's what he says to us. A salvation achieved by my suffering. Right? By each one of our suffering. Through my cross, Jesus says, so through our suffering put together with his. Right? And so it's then, if we do that, that we find in suffering an interior peace. It doesn't make the suffering go away. Right? We wouldn't want it to, because then we wouldn't have anything to offer. But we find in that suffering a peace at another level. Right? And that's what we see, for example, in Christ's Passion. He has the greatest extreme of suffering that was ever experienced and ever could be experienced. But at the end, what does he say? It is done. It is consummated. Right? There's a satisfaction in the fact that through that suffering, the world was redeemed. His beloved, us, were saved. And so there's a certain joy. And St. Paul brings this out. Colossians 1:24. Everybody should have that memorized. Colossians 1:24. I rejoice, St. Paul says, I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake. And he's speaking to the church in that city. But to fill up in his own person what is, quote unquote, lacking in the sufferings of Christ. Obviously nothing's lacking in the sufferings of Christ. But St. Paul says something's lacking. What's lacking? Our share in it so that we can participate in the gift. So John Paul II writes, a source of joy is found in the overcoming of the sense of the uselessness of suffering. A feeling sometimes very strongly rooted in human suffering. That feeling of meaninglessness can consume a person interiorly and seem to make him a burden to others. Right? So the worst part of suffering very often is feeling that we're a burden to everybody. Right? The elderly, they feel like they're just a burden. And in reality, it's just the opposite. Their suffering, if offered up, is the greatest contribution to everybody in reality. We can't see it, though, because it's invisible. It's purely spiritual. Right? And so Christ transforms that feeling that causes depression. Right? By showing us that in suffering we're serving our brothers and sisters. Right? We're carrying out, those who suffer are carrying out an irreplaceable service. In the body of Christ, it is precisely suffering permeated by the Spirit of Christ's sacrifice that is the irreplaceable mediator and author of the good things indispensable for the world's salvation. Right? When we suffer, if we suffer in this way, we're contributing more than we could in any other way. So when trials come our way, for example, if we're doing something, I don't know, as an apostolate, in the family, very often when a trial comes our way, we think, that's a sign that I'm not called to do this. Whereas we ought not to think that. We should think, that's a blessing on this, whatever it may be. Family life, pregnancy, a mission, religious life, apostolate. And that's how the saints saw it. No? Saint Teresa of Avila, she would see those trials as her capital. Her spiritual, it was like having capital in the bank. Spiritual capital. Whereas if everything went well, that was a bad sign. There's no capital in the bank for this enterprise. So John Paul II summarized this by saying, in this cosmic battle between good and evil, between the city of God and the city of Satan or sin, human sufferings, united to the redemptive value of suffering of Christ, constitute a special support for the powers of good and open the way to victory for the power of good. And I think this is a beautiful reflection for Lent.